Hi everyone, my name's Jon Bannister. I work at Man Group, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we've created a process which takes our Jupyter Notebooks from research into production. So just a little bit about myself first. My name's Jon Bannister. I'm a senior engineer within the Man Data Science group, where mostly we onboard data and draw analyses out. And as part of that function, we use Jupyter Notebooks quite a lot to encapsulate the research that the analysts are doing and also to share that. So one of the main problems that we have is that there's no real easy way to share a lot of the insights and make them reproducible. So on that, I also am lead of the Man Group Architecture Committee for Notebooks. And on that, we work to ensure that we're at the bleeding edge of the Jupyter ecosystem. So that means we look at new packages that are coming out, we determine which is best to use, lab, hub, notebook, and we, as part of that, we've created a tool called Notebooker, which will allow users to take their research from their computer into production really quickly. I'm also available on GitHub if you're interested, and that is also where you'll find my contributions to the Notebooker project. So this is a very common statement that we get from the researchers at Man Group, who say, hey, they've done some research. We work at an investment manager, so it's important that they have very good insights and they know exactly how to share these insights with other quants, other researchers internally. So they usually want some insights that they've created and they want to take them out and they want to reproduce them every day, for example. So they'll ask a developer like myself, so how do I get these insights out and how do I, can you do this for me, basically? And the answer is, we don't really have much time to do that. And so, this makes people sad and it's quite an inefficient way to operate because the research has already been done and the code's already there. We don't really need to rewrite it. We just kind of need to empower the researchers. So why don't we let the users themselves do the publishing and turn their notebooks into a kind of production quality report? So what's required for that? I mean, Jupyter Notebooks are great, but they're not really production tools usually. They're for research and for playing around, and they're brilliant, but they're not technically really for production usage. And so there are a lot of features missing, namely reviewability. How do you review a Jupyter Notebook? Templating. How do you take one Jupyter Notebook and produce others with that, and that falls under parametrization as well. If I want to run a report for every single stock in the Dow Jones, how will I do that? Would I have to write 50 different reports, 50 different notebooks? Ease of use, so making sure that non-technical users can actually, contribute to the ecosystem. Scheduling, so say I've written a report and I want it to be run every day. How do I ensure that and is that as easy as possible? Publishing, sending in a .ipy notebook file isn't a great way to share your insights, so is there a better way we can do that? And finally, testing to make sure that this is actually of a production quality and making sure that it's useful going forward and it won't break. So let me just talk first a little bit about what we've done internally. And then hopefully that'll give you some insights as to what you can take away and do in your own businesses or wherever, and give you a little bit of insight as to what we've done. So Notebook is a project that's been running since 2018. It was, I think, JupyterCon in Cardiff 2018 that gave us some of the ideas, where we heard about Jupytext, which I'll go into some detail on later, and Papermill, which is another really useful library that I'll also talk about a little bit later. And how do we combine those two and maybe we can turn this into a project which really empowers users to publish their own work. So this is what we've done. We've written a little web app around notebooks in general. So each line on this table here shows you results. So it's a successful report that's run. It's a Jupyter notebook that's been executed, basically. And it shows you a bit of metadata. It allows you to rerun it. And if it's gone completely wrong, it shows you how to delete it as well. This is what the results look like. So we've stripped away all the code from the results. You can toggle it if you really want. But it really shows the kind of more interesting stuff that people really want to see. So it's all in HTML. And also, we've got the option to generate PDFs as well using NBconvert. So that means that, in fact, you can output as you like. You can do a report and it will turn out like it's been done by a developer. So the difference between what a developer would produce and what a researcher can produce with the framework is kind of not very different. So this is a pretty powerful tool. A little overview of how it works. So there are two ways to run a notebook or report. So either you ask a scheduler like Jenkins or Cron or Airflow. You say, okay, I want to run this. Likewise, you can do exactly the same through the web app. So you run a template. You also give it some parameters that you add on top of the template. And then Jupytext converts your template into an IPy notebook, and then it can be executed by Papermill with the parameters added on top. Then when it's done, we save the results into a Mongo database, and we publish the results to email if you choose to. So it's available on GitHub now, so check it out, have a look, give it a star if it's a project that's useful to you. And yeah, feedback and pull requests are very welcome. So the solutions, so the things that we've addressed with Notebooker, this is probably much more applicable to you guys. Notebook is a useful tool, but there may be some concepts here that will be useful more generally. So you don't have to pick up Notebooker yourselves. You can just left out little bits that are cool. So firstly, taking a notebook and using it as a template. So there's loads of code in a notebook. In our example, we are a pure Python shop, pretty much. So we're using Jupyter Notebooks with Python. We strip out all of the results, so all of the graphs, all of the standard outs. We turn it into code, and we reuse that code to generate a new Jupyter Notebook. And with that, we can execute it and then store the results in a database. We use a tool called Jupytext, which I mentioned earlier. It's a really, really useful tool. I suggest you check it out. It's available on GitHub. I actually think he's doing a talk in this conference as well. So shout out to Mr. Woods, you're a legend. This is a really useful utility which allows you to interchangeably convert between an IPy notebook and the underlying code or markdown or whatever you like, and back. So it basically can sync your code file with the actual Jupyter Notebook file, which is really useful for what we're trying to do here. It also means that we can review things a lot more easily. So I don't know if you've used a Jupyter Notebook in the past in GitHub and tried to look at the diff, but an IPy notebook is a massive blob of JSON. It's really difficult to review, especially when picking apart what's happened. Especially with like an image change, it's just a blob of hex. So you're not really going to understand what's happened there. So there are existing tools to deal with that. So GitHub has some integration. I know there's a tool called mbdime, but by stripping out all of that, we've actually solved the problem by just converting to a Python file, which is, as it is, it's very easy to review because it's just a few lines rather than a very, very large file. So when you commit to Git, your template will appear on the web app automatically. So the web app, as soon as you make a request, it will go off to Git and check whether anything's changed in master. If it has, it pulls in. And therefore it refreshes as soon as you push to master. then it renders your template on the execution screen. So on the right there, you can see the highlighted cell, which is the parameters cell. And then you can see on the left how you're going to override that, what you're going to override that with, and you can actually write pure Python in that text box, which means it's not super secure, but that's not a massive concern for us internally because who's going to run it? And we've got security layers on top of security layers, so it's very unlikely that an untrusted party is going to run this, which means we can do interesting and cool things like executing Python on a web app. And also you can see there's an option here to email to yourself, have a custom title, and things that are generally useful for life admin, as it were. So something that I alluded to here, if you look in that cell that's yellow highlighted, those are the parameters. So how do we specify those parameters? And we want to override those parameters ideally. So if we've got a template, we really want to add some parameterization. So in our example here, we've got a toy example where we want to run a version of a report of every color of the rainbow. So here what we're going to do is add a color parameter to the template. So color is red in this case. And then we run the report multiple times, once per color. So instead of having to write 7 different notebooks or reports, we just write one and we add a template for the color, a parameter for the color rather. So to add these parameters, we use cell tags, which is a kind of not very commonly used feature in Jupyter Notebooks. In fact, it was only very recently added to Jupyter Lab, the supports. Otherwise, you had to use cell tab extensions, I think it's called. So it's not a very commonly used feature, but it's really useful for our use case because we can specify here this cell is something that we want to be able to override. And then what we do is we use PaperMill, which I mentioned earlier, which can execute the notebook with these parameters added, which is awesome because that means that we can then take our template and suddenly we just write 7 cron jobs or 7 Jenkins jobs or whatever to execute the reports and get the results that we need. So in terms of ease of use, I mentioned earlier that we auto pull from Git. Internally at Man Group, everything is using Git. We have quite technical researchers, and so the kind of common sense thing to do was, let's just use Git for everything. And so when we deploy our notebooks, it's literally just as simple as committing to Git, which means that from a user's standpoint, all you need to do is take your Jupyter Notebook, convert it into Python, which is automatically done by Jupytext, and then commit that Python file. Once it's merged into master, great, you've got a report in production. Wonderful. So let's follow through an example of our rainbow. So here we've got the Jupyter template. So we've converted from IPyNotebook into Python file using Jupytext. So here's what it looks like. That's the output of Jupytext. It's pretty stripped down. You can pretty easily understand what's going on there. A bit of metadata at the top, which is useful for Jupytext and also for executing with PaperMill. Then we've merged to master, so it appears in the UI, which is great. So we go to examples rainbow, and then we see here that our highlighted cell is the parameter cell, which is perfect. We add, if you can see on the right there, it says color equals yellow, so we've added our parameter, and the report has started running with a cute little animation, which you can't see here, sadly. And you get all of the standard out, so you can see exactly what's going on. And then finally you get your results here, and you get this kind of disgusting yellow report, which is not very pleasant to look at, but that's what we wanted. So what I've shown you here is that you can basically add in any parameter you like, and you can override it very easily using Notebooker, and then suddenly your results are shareable. So here you've got a unique URL at the top of the page, which will send you to this result and this result only. And it's all stored in Mongo, so it can be retrieved very easily later. And an example of the PDF generation, this is what it looks like. A future enhancement that we kind of want to add is that ideally we remove the code from the PDF, but for now this is what it looks like. So some people find this very useful, especially researchers who want to send it to clients, for example. So in terms of scheduling, once we've got a template and we like it, usually what we want to do is see what it looks like every day or every week. So in terms of deployment, there are a couple of options here, but what we really want to do is make sure that we're running in a convenient and a consistent way. So Docker is a really good choice here because that allows us to have a very consistent workspace, and to make sure that our requirements are all in place. We in the notebook templates repository that you're committing in Git to, you have a notebook requirements.txt, which means that you add in all of the package requirements that you have, so like pandas, numpy, whatever. So PaperMill allows us to execute these templates, and we give it the kernel to use, which means that when we build the kernel in the Docker image, it's there forever because it's a Docker image. And then with our new Jupyter notebooks, we can just execute with exactly the same environments. The only time we need to rebuild the Docker image is when we add new requirements into the notebook requirements.txt. The backend, which actually executes these reports, is exactly the same. So we've obviously done a wrapper around PaperMill where we save the results into Mongo afterwards. But that uses exactly the same backend for both the command line and for the web app itself. So we've ensured that the code is the same, you're running the same thing, and it means that it's just a bit more consistent as well. You can call the command line from any schedule you like, so Airflow, Kubernetes, Jenkins, cron, whatever. And because everything's stored in MongoDB, it's easily browsable afterwards. So publishing and sharing. So there's some features here which were added by internal contributors. So we have a pretty big internal open source community, if that makes sense, where people are allowed to kind of spend 10% of their time on whatever they like. So there's a small team dedicated to working with notebooks and Notebooker, and people come in and contribute things. And one of the things that was contributed was the ability to search. For example, if we take my rainbow example earlier, where I ran for the color blue, I want to find the latest report that was successful as of a given date, because I think that something changed with the color blue a month ago. So you can do that because we're using a Mongo database, which means we can search for parameters, and it's very easy to just retrieve from a query of your choice. So we've added a bunch of helpful URLs to the web app itself to do this searching for you, but because we're storing in a database, you can just go and do an ad hoc search for yourself as well, which is great. We store everything, and therefore we browse everything within one instance. And so teams within the company have set up their own instances of Notebooker. So they've got a kind of team-specific instance, which can be locked down if you want. So, for example, we've got a portfolio management team internally, and they've completely locked it down. So only that team can view that instance. And so everything is kind of confined to one instance, but that means that the URLs that you're generating are very much pointed at that one thing. So that's very useful. And finally, so we really want to check that once we've deployed these reports, we want to keep them running. It would be pretty bad if we set something up to run one day and then it completely flopped over in 3 days' time. So actually a really nice thing about using Jupytext to convert to Python, and keeping everything in Python in the GitHub repository of templates means that we can just use PyTest. We can execute the files from start to finish, make sure it's running fine, People can add custom tests, so they assert that something has happened at the end of their notebook. But mostly, as a framework, what we've decided to do is make sure that so finally, testing. So in the use case where you deployed something that you want to run once a day, and in 3 days' time it falls over, that's not great. So definitely in production, but in this case where we're trying to treat Jupyter Notebooks like their production reports, it's extra, the sort of extra concern that we want to make sure that stuff is still running and executable. So the great thing about using the Jupytext library means that our IPy notebooks are now Python files, and they're stored in Python in Git. And that means that we can just run PyTest. We can make sure that all of these Python files are executing as we hope them to, and then assert that certain things have happened afterwards. So make sure that we've saved to the database and it's success. It is a success. Things like that. So that's really nice. But a caveat of this is that your notebook shouldn't really do anything outside of the notebook experience. So, for example, your notebook shouldn't go off and write to a database. That would be pretty bad if you're running that in a unit test. So we allow people to opt out of regression testing for their notebook instances. But we've created the functionality for people to use it there, and therefore just execute your notebooks and see how they go. There are tools out there for IPy notebooks in general, for you to test and make assertions within a Jupyter notebook. But in this case, we're just converting to Python, so we just use PyTest. So some final thoughts. Notebooks as reports have kind of actually been a surprising success. I really only created them in the data science team, just for my own pleasure, really. I had some reports that I had to run. I didn't really want to write a reporting framework, and I figured, I can write this in a Jupyter notebook and publish that notebook. It's now being used by more than 20 teams across the whole business. So it's being used for a massive gamut of all use cases you can imagine. But it can be anything from Jira reporting, sprints, data quality, production monitoring, portfolio management, anything really. So it's obviously useful. I really hope that it's been a useful and insightful talk for you guys. Maybe giving you some ideas as well for yourselves on what to take away for your own businesses and what's going on there. So in conclusion, have a look at the Notebooker project. It's a silly name, I know, but it's got a place in my heart. It's a really useful tool, and do join the community, raise some issues, pull requests are absolutely welcome. Give us a star, and thank you very much for listening. Here's some legal stuff, which has been put here by compliance. So read that if you really want.